Okay. So, Dan, thank you very much for agreeing to have this conversation. It's a conversation that we hope will shed some light on the discussion around the integrity of Gonzalo Lira and what it may mean more widely. First of all, I'd like to ask you whether you do in fact think that the discussion about Gonzalo Lira's integrity is generally relevant, and if you do, why that might be.
Well, I do think it's relevant because, first of all, we see this replayed over and over again, right? If you think of people like Julian Assange, for example, comes to mind. There were huge debates about his integrity, which, well, I would not say were important. I would say, honestly, were probably a sideshow in the sense that whatever picadillos that Julian Assange may or may not have didn't take away from the fact that he's being unjustly held, in very awful conditions for years before trial, right? So this is a huge due process violation. But yeah, people went down this for a while. I don't know if it's still happening, but people went down a rabbit hole of questioning his integrity as a human being and whatnot. Which I think in the case of Julian Assange was very dangerous, and I think it's very dangerous in the case of Gonzalo Lira. First of all, we should just remind people or tell people for the first time, if they don't know, Gonzalo Lira is a journalist who has been covering the war in Ukraine for years. He's been living in Ukraine. Is it Kherson that he's been living in, I think?
Kharkov.
But so that's one of the four regions that went with Russian last. And he was arrested on video and, presumably held for a few months. And then he seemed to be released, and now it seems he may have been recaptured. Okay, those are the basic facts as we know them. His father, we know, has expressed grave concern for his well-being. His friends at the Duran, both Alexanders, and also Berlik, who's from
Brian Berletic.
Berletic. They've all expressed very grave concern about him and defend his integrity. But there is some questioning whether this is all ruse and whether Gonzalo Lira may in fact be an SBU agent, the SBU being the Ukrainian intelligence services, which are quite brutal. Okay. Now, again, to get to your question more succinctly, it's important to talk about this because obviously if it is true that he's being held at the moment by the SBU, it means his life could be in mortal danger. We know this. And so I think people questioning his integrity at this moment, to me, is dangerous. It puts him in jeopardy because, well, for a couple reasons. Obviously, if people don't stand by him, then his captors may feel they have impunity to do whatever they want with him, right? Because they'll feel like, well, if we kill the guy, there's a lot of people saying he's just an agent anyway, and he's a bad guy, and he's not a real journalist, so there's not a huge consequence to that for them. So that's very dangerous. And the other thing is we just can't know. That is to say, any theory about him being an SBU agent is simply a theory. There's no, we don't have any evidence of it. There may be some circumstantial evidence of it that people at least have, they've imputed from the facts, but we don't know. It's not like, someone has the documentation showing his contract with the SBU or something. There's nothing like that. It's all theory. And to espouse these theories in public, I think, are very dangerous. I think puts his life at risk needlessly. I mean, what's being gained by it? What is being gained by outing him as an alleged SBU agent? I don't see it. Now, the counter would be the one commentator who thinks he's an SBU agent, George, I'm forgetting his last name.
George Eliasson.
Yeah, he thinks that, or he surmises, he presumes that Gonzalo Lira was harvesting people's people who commented on his Twitter feed, that he was harvesting their metadata for the SBU. Okay. So.
Well, in fact, permit me to interrupt there for a moment, Dan, because George Eliasson, as I understand it, has indeed suggested that, but he's also made the point that two local reporters that he knows were contacted independently on different occasions by Gonzalo Lira, who was looking for their personal information. And he adds that to the reasons for his suspicions about Gonzalo Lira.
Right. But the point being that George may counter me by saying, well, there are reasons to out him because those people who've been commenting on his Twitter feed and who continue to comment on his Twitter feed may have their metadata harvested by the SBU. But my response to that would be, so what? I mean, most of these people, first of all, the SBU is not going to go after every Tom, Dick, and Harry who comments on Lira's site. Okay, let's be honest. I mean, and I imagine most of the people commenting on it are Westerners who live in the West, who live in Europe, who live in the United States. They're not going after all those people. I mean, so I don't see the risk to the people. Let's assume George is right. Let's assume that was being done. I don't see those people as at risk because it was being done. So so that just leads me back to the same point, that while the fate of Gonzalo Lira remains unclear, but there's a possibility he could be harmed, why question his integrity at this moment? Especially because who he is and what he is will be revealed in the fullness of time.
Right.
Hopefully not in a tragic way. But I mean, if he were killed, I guess, and that turned out it was proved he was killed by the SBU, well, I think we could probably assume he wasn't an SBU agent. So that's that. But, meanwhile, a lot of harm's been done. And again, maybe the theorizing about his lack of integrity contributed to his being killed. So what's the point? Why go down this rabbit hole of attacking basically a fellow journalist? That's what I find maybe most troubling here. I mean, the lack of solidarity with this guy based on, again, just theories and presumptions that, some have some sort of facial appeal and but that are merely theories. I mean, you have to go back to the criminal presumption of innocence before proving guilty. And why is that done? Because if you don't presume that, people are going to lose life or liberty unfairly, right, and without due process. Well, he's in the same boat. He's not being the risk isn't criminal, him being put in the dock. The risk, though, is that he could be killed. And so you would think at least people who are ostensible allies of him, people ostensibly on the same side as him, would not be questioning his innocence at this moment when he may be in peril. That's what's really, and even think George said, if I recall correctly, that even he says, well, whatever he is, obviously I don't want him to be harmed and that sort of thing. And we have to at least advocate for him not to be harmed. But the truth is, by questioning his integrity, that works against that concern.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Dan. So can we move on a bit to?
Yeah. Yes.
This might turn out to be quite a long discussion, actually, because, and I agree with you generally that we certainly don't want any harm to come to Gonzalo Lira, and there are various things that issues the whole discussion around whether or not he deserves our support. Now, obviously, any person in his situation under threat of serious injury or death deserves our solidarity. But that shouldn't lead us to ignore some of the issues that have cropped up, for example, which are of course secondary issues in terms of Gonzalo Lira's well-being. But they are important from my point of view because I think what strikes me about the discussion is the way both sides leave out information that they find inconvenient. And permit me to speak perhaps at some length about.
Yeah, sure.
You very kindly sent me a link to a discussion between Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mercouris, Brian Belletic, and Angelo, I think his surname is Giuliano, in which they discuss the predicament in which Gonzalo Lira finds himself and the adverse response from some people to Gonzalo Lira's apparent disappearance, because nobody knows what's happened to him for some time now. But in their discussion, I was struck by the way in which they glibly dismissed, in my opinion, glibly, the adverse comments by other people like George Ellison that you mentioned, also Scott Ritter, Vanessa Beeley, Eva Bartlett, people whom we respect. And I think that that's a failing on all our part, that we tend to dismiss views that we find inconvenient, but we do so at a cost, which means that people might well take less seriously the points of view that we're trying to put across in terms of the ideas and political movements and people that we support. So, for example, Brian Belletic stated in the exchange with the two Alexanders and Angelo that he'd challenged Scott Ritter about Scott Ritter's opinion that Gonzalo Lira might be an SBU agent, which, from my point of view, I disagree entirely with Scott Ritter's suggestion. Well, perhaps not entirely, but the point about Brian's challenge to Scott is that he took Scott's inability to explain why he thought Gonzalo Lira may be an SBU agent as some kind of definitive argument to be able to dismiss that accusation. And it's not. I mean, it just means that at that moment, Scott Ritter didn't have anything to say to justify his case. It doesn't mean that there isn't a case, right? But Brian Belletic's interpretation of Scott's failure to present evidence was that there is no evidence, and that's just, and there's evidence in the sense that you have suggested in terms of people being regarded as innocent until proven guilty. But in the kind of, unfortunately in my life, I have experience of the kind of situation in which an individual is placed where there's an information war. And you simply, I think on your part, it's not entirely reasonable to say that you can't make any suggestions or allegations or even accusations if you can't produce concrete evidence, because there are many circumstances in which that's just not possible, especially in the heat of a conflict like the one that's going on in Ukraine, for example. I'm thinking in Spanish, in Ukraine. So I found that a bit unreasonable on Brian Belletic's part. Um, and But on the whole, I think that their position is correct. I think that on the whole, they are right to say that the correct thing to happen is for Ukraine to deport this person who's been critical of government policies, and everything else is practically irrelevant. And I tend to sympathize with that view. But I do question the readiness of Brian and the two Alexanders and perhaps Angelo too, to dismiss out of hand the possibility that Gonzalo Lira may have succumbed to pressure, not necessarily to become some kind of full-blown agent, whatever that may mean. But I don't know about you, but in my past, I've been accused of being a CIA agent.
Yeah,
You
I've
know?
been accused of being a CIA agent, a KGB agent, of
Yeah.
course.
So all these things happen, and under certain circumstances, especially given the amount of pressure to which Gonzalo Lira has been subjected, he may have offered, in exchange for some relief of the pressure against him, to cooperate at some level. And who knows? We just don't know, as you say. We just don't know. We just don't know one way or the other. So it's perfectly possible he may have succumbed at some point, even temporarily, to have agreed to cooperate in some way with the Ukrainian intelligence services. We just don't know, and we can't dismiss that possibility, which is something that I think Brian and his colleagues in that discussion seem to do. On the other hand, I also think that it's extremely misguided on the part of people like George Eliasson, Vanessa Beeley, Eva Bartlett, and Scott Ritter to dismiss the perfectly common sense explanations for the criticisms and questions that they put to Gonzalo Lira, or about Gonzalo Lira. For example, they question how did he get away without having the tracing bracelet placed on his person?
And with
How
his passport.
how did he get his passport back? And the answer to that is very simple, because the Ukrainian system, the Ukrainian authorities are utterly corrupt. So if he could mobilize enough money to pay people to offer him the circumstances to make his escape, that is a perfectly common sense, sensible explanation for how he managed to do that. And then they may say, oh, well, how did he have access to such cash? And the answer to that is, if, as Gonzalo Lira has done, you've lived in that corrupt society for 8 years and you know perfectly well that the authorities are going to target your bank accounts and your credit cards, for example, then, and I know this for myself from my experience of what other people have done here in Central America, what you can do is operate solely in cash. And people may make the observation, well, how can you operate with such large sums of cash? Well, anybody familiar with organized crime knows that it's perfectly possible to conceal $100,000 in 10 wads of $100 bills, 100 each. That's $10,000. That's easy to do.
Right.
And if you have access to left luggage facilities or trusted intermediaries, it's perfectly possible to operate on a cash basis in a politically hostile environment. That's what organized crime does. That's what the terrorist movements do. That's how they operate when they have to. So, but those arguments and those observations never appear in the discussions that one sees on the part of people like George Eliasson, Scott Ritter, Eva Bartlett, Vanessa Beeley, and so on. So on both sides, you have a tendency or even a predisposition to trash anything that contradicts your preconceptions and your prejudices. And do you think that's reasonable on my part to make those observations?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that's true. Though I would be more inclined to say that that the side of the Duran, the people you mentioned, the two Alexanders and Brian and the other gentleman, I would think I'm more sympathetic to them kind of dismissing things out of hand, at least at this moment, and kind of, not feeding the flames, even by frankly dignifying some of the arguments. Again, while the guy's being held, we think, by the SBU. That is to say that there is a time and a place for everything. And I don't think, this is necessarily the time to, have a full-blown debate about the guy's integrity while he's sitting in a place where he could be killed. That's my own view on it.
I agree with you very much, Dan. I agree with that view, and I agree with the argument that Brian and his colleagues in that discussion make, that the right thing to do, the correct thing to do, even the administratively correct thing to do, independent of any political criteria, the legally correct thing to do is for the Ukrainian authorities to deport Gonzalo Lira. But then, thank you for agreeing that my observations aren't completely out of place.
I think
you see, I think that discussion goes far beyond the importance of the discussion about Gonzalo Lira, because I think it's a fundamental weakness of the anti-imperialist movement, or people trying to kind of build a consensus sufficiently strong to resist and even roll back the monolithic, the massive media power of the North American and European elites, and the way that they always dominate with ease the public discussion of any event: Ukraine, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and any foreign policy discussion is completely skewed against the facts, because in large part we have been unable to mobilize ourselves with sufficient efficiency and sufficient solidarity to be able to, and I think solidarity is, as you pointed out earlier on, is the key thing, regardless of our political differences. And obviously I have very different political opinions to Brian Berletic, Alexander Mercouris, Alex Christoforou and Angelo Giuliano, but I do respect their views, and I think they're very effective communicators, and I think that people like George Eliasson, Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett and Scott Ritter are also very effective and very important voices in the effort to roll back the ridiculous, absurd psychological warfare consensus developed by the Western elites. So, and I think that's why I think this discussion about, how do we approach issues like the discussion of Gonzalo Lira is absolutely fundamental to our ability to organize ourselves. And what do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, I agree with your overall concern about, maybe the lack of intellectual rigor amongst the left and in dealing with the arguments of the other side point by point. And I certainly think that's an issue.
Or even the right, because I don't think anybody would accuse Brian Berletic and the Duran team of being, left wing, and would you? Or Larry Johnson?
That's a good point. I would, yeah. Although I would say, objectively, it's left wing on the Ukraine issue. Whether they may be conservatives or whatever in certain things, but on that issue, I see them as objectively left wing, whether they consider themselves or not. Certainly, they're bolstering the left wing's, ammunition on all this stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think the intellectual rigor in general in society has gone down quite a bit, and willingness of people to have any debate about any issue, right? I mean, you don't even see debates much anymore. All you see is one-sided podcasts or monologues,
Right.
which doesn't require people to have to muster a real rigorous argument against anything, right? And I do see that as a huge problem. Again, as you say, yeah, not just for the left, yeah, but for the overall society. I mean, we've kind of lost even the desire to do that. I'll just give one example I saw that I thought was very compelling, the example. So I saw Jimmy Dore this morning, and he had a story on how in Congress, before a committee, there was a debate whether to show this video of a doctor who's very pro-trans and who's performing trans surgeries on people. And the Democrats opposed it being shown in the committee, but they were outvoted by the Republicans. So it was shown, and the Democrats just walked out on it. They wouldn't watch it, even though this was a guy who would be sympathetic to the Democrats' position on it. But he was talking about things in this, transition surgery very proudly, but they happen to be facts which are not very palatable to people about what he's doing to adolescents in terms of very experimental and dangerous surgeries. And the Democrats just didn't want to hear it. They just left. And that's kind of where we're at, that they, people won't even hear the other side.
Right.
Much less try to absorb what they say and then try to counter it. So I think is what you're saying goes to the overall political discourse, certainly in the United States, which is what I can talk about the most, is the United States. And it's left us, again, we just talk to our own people, and we just have our own, silos that we operate in, and it does not allow us to come to any sort of consensus on things or really change people's minds.
Yeah, and that's definitely. I know. Obviously, my focus is practically entirely on Nicaragua, so I'm kind of in a very small area of the overall information universe, a tiny area. But that my experience does reflect that observation. In general, I think it's also a function of the complete collapse of reporting standards. Never mind journalism. I think journalism practically has ceased to exist, and that for a very long time. I think it's all been replaced by psychological warfare. And I think one of the effects of that shift from what one might in the past have been able to call respectable journalism to outright psychological warfare has created that environment that you've just described, where, as a result of the psychological warfare against particular views, nobody will even listen to those views. And it's very difficult to know what to do about that. And that raises the whole issue of, is it even worthwhile trying to engage with people who outright reject any kind of, if you present this as factual information, this is testimony from people who have suffered as a direct result of the policies that you advocate. And for example, the work of Vanessa Billy and Eva Bartlett in Syria and Palestine, for example, has produced massive material, irrefutable material. But that material just gets completely shoved to the margins and ignored in mainstream discussions, and it doesn't even figure. So, what is one to do in that situation? And I've produced quite a lot of material about the truth of the situation in Nicaragua, based on testimony from people about the events in 2018, for example, on testimony about the reality of indigenous people on Nicaragua's northern Caribbean coast, for example, and it's it's completely buried. It doesn't even, it makes barely an impact except in circles that for one reason or another are interested in what happens in Nicaragua. But in general, and that it raises what you've just explained, raises the whole issue of, is it even worthwhile trying to engage in discussion with people who point blank reject any attempt to offer information that challenges their prejudices?
Yeah, well, there's certain people that certainly you can't engage with because of that. I'll just give an example. I had a discussion with a woman the other day about the whole Ukraine situation, and we were talking about Crimea, and I said, well, I was just in Crimea, and I said, I can guarantee you that, and this has been shown now by a couple referenda there, that the people of Crimea want to be part of Russia. And in fact, the mainstream press, when they were honest about this before the special military operations began, admitted that the people in Crimea were happy being part of Russia again. And her response to me was, I don't care. And I said, what do you mean? You don't care what the Crimeans, what they want? You don't care whether they want to be part of Russia? Right, I don't care. So you have people that'll just say, I guess I can't refute those facts, so I'm just not going to care about those facts. So what can you say to someone like that? There's nothing. Now, hopefully there's enough people willing to listen to reason. And I think there are, and the polls show that. The polls show at the moment, for example, in the U.S., that a majority of the people now do not support further military aid to Ukraine. Now, that's huge. And obviously, that's not because of what they've heard from the mainstream press. It's obviously because a lot of people, I think, are seeking out alternative voices on this and are moved by that. So that gives me some hope that there are enough people that can listen to reason and can listen to facts, which means we need to keep, mounting our facts and working hard to be rigorous in what we say and do. As you say, and I just want to say that I think your work, Stephen, on Nicaragua is the very best. I think Tortilla Gonzalo is, and I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you. I think you are very rigorous in a very impressive way. I mean, you sit down and you bore through the problem, and I appreciate that. And I think all of us need to take some inspiration from that, because it's not always an easy thing to do, because, whatever argument we have on any given subject, we're going to have some weaknesses. I mean, the facts don't always match what we want to prove. I mean, right. But as a science, if you compare it to science, and science literally just means knowledge, right? So that the scientific method could really be applied to any sort of argumentation or whatever, is you don't change the facts to try to reach the conclusion you want. Right? You have to deal with those facts. And sometimes you may have to just throw up your hands and say, okay, look, these facts don't necessarily support what I'm saying, but the overall facts do. And, you're much more credible if you're able to do that. Right.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the reason why we should pay attention to the weaknesses on both sides of the argument about Gonzalo Lira, and on any argument, the arguments over Julian Assange, for example, which you mentioned earlier on. But anyway, thank you very much for your kind encouragement, Dan, and thank you very much for helping us reach this conclusion that we've just got to keep on keeping on in order to try and contest the information space that is so dominated by Western elites at the moment. And it's encouraging to know that you think we're making progress, at least on Ukraine.
I do. And again, Stephen, you're definitely a beacon in terms of all this, and I want to encourage you to keep going because you do great work. So
thanks, Dan. Thanks. So on that encouraging note, let's say goodbye, and thank you very much for joining me for this conversation.
My pleasure, Stephen. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll stop recording now.